wandering in, so we'll let them get a seat. As you can see, Daniel will be doing a PowerPoint presentation, so you may want to sit where you can see the screen, one side or the other. It's right in the middle. So, and he will probably be standing on that side by his computer, so if that's blocking your view, there's lots of seats on this side. I know it's a little further walk, but you may be able to see the screen better, so. Well, I want to welcome you all and not do too long an introduction because Daniel has informed me he has a full 45 minutes, if not beyond, and if you have to leave by 2 o'clock, that's fine. He will stay as long as necessary to talk about his passion. And I've warned him that there's some people in the group that have told me they're as passionate about this as he is, or almost anyway, and are here to learn. So Daniel is a member of Westminster. He's been here longer than I have, that I know, and his passion is for the indigenous peoples in the area, what their history is, and what our history is related to them. In other words, this land that we are on, what is the history of this land, and then also Camp Henry. And so he has been researching, and since his last presentation, which you may have been to at Faith Formation last fall, he's come up with more information. And so he is just a fountain of new knowledge about these peoples, and he's raising his eyebrows, and he knows a lot more about them than I do. So I am going to turn it over to him for the presentation. And I'll let him let you know when questions are most appropriate, whether he wants them during or at the end.
Thank you. Okay. Is my mic on, Ian? We good? Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me to come back. It was a year ago I did this similar presentation in the chapel. I'm told by Jen that there was 72 people in the room, the most ever for a topic for adult faith formation, which kind of crossed us over the line with the fire marshal because it was too many people in one room. So the sanctuary is a much safer place for this. So the topic is the land on which Westminster Presbyterian Church abides, mainly focusing on the pre-European history, but a little bit on early Grand Rapids. And I'm learning a new computer, so let's see how this works. Okay. First, I want to thank our benefactors, Florence Beale and her sister Minnie Louise Beale. Some of you may know that they were members here at Westminster for many years, Florence for 24 years, Minnie for 44 years. Two sisters, they had no children, but this was their church home. And through a bequest upon their passing, Westminster is one of 3 organizations that gets monies in perpetuity from land that they inherited from a maternal uncle, 69,000 acres, which is the largest private land holding in the state of Louisiana. Okay, so it's through their generosity that WPA and the youth program and the scholarship to Alma College. So I want to hold them up and give a moment of thanks and gratitude to God for their generosity. A show of hands, does anybody here have a known Native or Indigenous or Indian family history? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. That's wonderful. It's a personal story. It's a family story. It's not just something abstract or cognitive, but it affects many families, even here at Westminster. Personal statement. So why do I support Indigenous people? I have a debt of gratitude to the Indigenous peoples. Through my family genealogy research, I have learned that I am the beneficiary of intergenerational wealth partially made possible by farms on land ceded to the U.S. government by various Indian nations. In 1866, my great-great-grandparents immigrated from the Netherlands to the U.S. After about 20 years of farming 20 miles south of Chicago, present-day South Holland, Illinois, they farmed near Orange City, Iowa, for 2 years, and then moved to Corsica, South Dakota, to farm for 30 years until they died. The land they farmed had been ceded from various Indian tribes and nations. The 30 acres in South Holland, Illinois, had been ceded by an October 1832 treaty from the Potawatomi tribe of the Prairie and the Kankakee. The 80 acres in Orange City, Iowa, had been ceded by an 1837 treaty from the Iowa tribe of the Oklahoma Sioux. And the 163 acres in Corsica, South Dakota, had been ceded by an 1836 treaty from the Yankton Sioux. For this, I owe a debt of gratitude to these indigenous peoples, and my efforts to educate myself and others is a form of reparation. Yes? Volume? I don't know if, Ian, can you adjust my volume up? Okay, is that better? How's that? No? It's hard to do this without a mirror. Outdoor voice? Okay. Digging in the past. So the people have lived, humans have lived in the Grand River Valley for approximately 11,000 years. So I want to compress 11,000 years into 45 minutes. Let's see how I do. This is known because of extensive archaeological work in the valley, and it continues ongoing. Just to kind of refresh people's memory, if you've taken any kind of anthropology class, the Paleo-Indian period, the Archaic period, the Late Archaic period, and the Woodland period. We're going to focus mainly on the Woodland. Here is a photo of a leaf-shaped projectile point made of flint, or I think it's pronounced chert. A few of these have been found in the Grand Rapids area, and these are from the Paleo-Indian era, so that would be 9,000 to 6,000 BC. The Late Archaic period, this is what I've been working on the last month. There appears to be a Late Archaic burial site, which has been called the Esler site, uncovered during the construction in 1965 along the west bank of the Grand River by Leonard. And apparently Mr. John Esler was expanding his motorcycle business, and in the course of digging, they found that this was a burial site. So apparently there's no other known archaic burial sites along the Grand River, just that one. There they found remains of 7 individuals and 67 related funerary objects. The Woodland period, which is the most recent, lasted about 2,000 years. It's divided into early, middle, and late. During the early period is when the Indians would develop burial mound complexes. Those began about 500 BC. That's not Abraham, he's 1,000 BC. Who's about 500? Is that the, in our scriptural history? 500 BC, what was going on in the Bible at that time? Anyway, that's when they were building these mound complexes, and what they gather is it took probably dozens of people to build one mound, and they would do them every couple of years. And men, women, and children would be buried in the grave, along with goods, trade goods, that the mounds people would have bartered and bought and sold within each other. So the best manifestation of the woodland period is the Hopewell culture. Hopewell is the name that archaeologists have given to similar artifact styles and burial practices from the Florida coast to Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So here's a map that shows the Hopewell interaction sphere. So it's north of Lake Superior all the way to the Gulf Coast, pretty much Missouri River Valley, approximating the East Coast. So the Hopewell, these burial practices were common in all of that area. And there was a trading network of these groups with each other. What they have found is the items that people would be buried with were items from a very extensive trade network. So conch shells from the Gulf, obsidian and grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, copper from Isle Royale, and flint from Ohio and Indiana. So they would find those items in the burial mounds in Grand Rapids. So it was a very extensive trading network. One of the first burial mounds to be excavated, there was an Ohio farmer named Hopewell. So the Hopewell Indians, it's because of that guy's last name. And the largest mounds were found in the, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Seattle, and the Paint Creek River valleys by Chillicothe, Ohio. So if we go back to the map, you can see the Ohio Hopewell here. Yes?
Daniel, I believe in Ohio, somewhere in there, is either a state or national monument for that, for the Hopewell.
Yeah, there's a number of parks and monuments, and that's not actually on my short list of places to visit. Yeah, because it's much more of a cultural awareness in that area, because that was like the foci of that culture, which as you can see, covered like a third of present-day U.S. So the mound builders, otherwise known as the Hopewell Indians, they lived in this Grand River Valley over 2,000 years ago, near present-day Granville. They're known, of course, for their large burial mounds. The ones around here were built about 100 BC to 200 AD, so in that 300-year window. And the group of Hopewell mounds in Grand Rapids are formally called the Norton Mound Site, or the Hopewell Indian Mounds Park. And that letter number designation comes from the federal government, so they codify these sites that are found for Indian burials as a way to track them. And the ones here in Grand Rapids, the Norton Mound Group, are some of the best preserved in the Great Lakes area. Indian burial grounds, so the Kent Scientific Institute explored 8 groups, a total of 46 mounds, just south of the city limits in 1874, which would have been Hall Street. And the Kent Scientific Institute was a successor to the Grand Rapids Lyceum of Natural History, which John Ball helped organize in 1854. Some of you may know the name John Ball. Maybe we'll do our segue right here. So yesterday I'm at the public library, and I say, I'm going to do this presentation with the senior adults at Westminster, and I understand you have these books that you're giving away free. Can I take like 5 or 6? So they gave me a whole case. Born to Wander, autobiography of John Ball. Feel free to take one. If we run out, they tell me they have 3 or 4 more cases. I will get them to you. And I've used this as a reference in my talk. There's some very good material here. So when they would find these bodies in this burial site, what funerary objects would they find? Often it would be copper implements, pottery, drinking vessels, trinkets, vases, kettles, bowls, and effigy pipes. Not all of those in every grave, but usually some combination of those items. Yes.
These were sacred sites, were they not?
And they still are. Yes.
People, and they just went in there and broke them up.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. These burial sites, like the Essler site by the river in Leonard, there's no plaque, there's no marker. And part of that is because historically, Indian burial sites would be desecrated. So the local Indian community doesn't really want to have it identified. And the federal government has implemented other mechanisms to keep them safe, and I'll go into that in just a moment. Yeah. It'd be like Oak Hill Cemetery in Grand Rapids for us just to get a bulldozer and just flatten it and put up a mall. That's kind of how we've done to the indigenous. Here are some photographs of items found in the Norton Mound burial group. So the copper celts or the axe heads, and then the 6-inch long hairpins are some examples of what they have found with the human remains. So there's basically 3 locations in the Grand Rapids area. I don't want to get too bogged down here. But the burial grounds at the Indian village below Pearl Street Bridge, which is the Converse Mounds, there was a grouping of 30 mounds there, but in the 19th century they were defaced, they were leveled for construction of streets. So that's an example of going to Oak Hill Cemetery, bulldozing it, putting up a mall. That's what we did for the Converse Mounds. The Norton Mounds, which still exist along Indian Mounds Drive, are the best preserved in the Grand Rapids, Great Lakes area, and they're under the purview of the Grand Rapids Public Museum. So they're like the legal entity over that, over those mounds. So here's a map from 1853, and I'll use my low-tech pointer. So this is where the Converse Indian Mounds were. So here's Fulton Street, Grand River. So there were mounds here. And then down here by Butterworth, where Geelock and Lexington cross, was the Roman Catholic Mission and Cemetery. So these mounds, which is where Grand Valley is now, those have been just obliterated. We don't have any information about that, nor here. The Norton Mounds are further downriver, and of course the Essler site was up by Leonard Street. All of them are within like a city block of the river, okay? And they're not, and I was even thinking, are they always on the east side or the west side? There's variation, but they're usually all within a city block of the river. So here's a current photo of Seward and Fulton. So as you're facing southeast, this is where the Converse Mounds were. You might be able to tell. This is the train station, the railroad tracks. Grand Valley's up this way. This is the Grand Valley building. And it's about a block and a half from the Grand River. And then where the Catholic Mission and the cemetery is at Geelagh and Butterworth, southwest. Now it's kind of an industrial area, also by the edge of Grand Valley. So last fall, the Justice Committee here at Westminster had a tour of the Norton Mounds by Ron Yobb of the Grand River Bands of the Ottawa Indians. He's their chairman. So he took us there in November. Here's some photographs. You can see the mound with mature trees growing out of it. And another view. It's truly a very sacred and a peaceful place.
Is it protected
Yes,
by the government?
yes. It's accessible if you know where to look. We had a tour guide and he takes Grand Valley students there also, so it's kind of general knowledge, but it is private, it's closed to the public, and it is protected. Here's a smaller mound. If you see in the background, you see the kind of green that's higher up, that's I-196. So that's the interstate between Grand Rapids and Granville.
Could I just make a comment?
Sure.
I was on that trip, and I think one of the mind-blowing things, the group, was the fact that only one person is buried in each mound.
We asked that of Ron. He says, how many are buried in each? He said one.
Yeah, so
And I've read an,
I was hearing the response to, to that fact. I think it's just very, I don't know, it's just interesting because I think we think about like, quote, mass grave
Yeah.
or something like that,
Yeah.
like and things like
Yeah.
that. And it was like, wow, then they must have had, like, how could they have so many? And
Yeah.
they're like, well, there wasn't everybody else, like we live in this big city, we're so close together, there was
Yeah.
so much abundance of land.
yeah, Ron said that there was one, other sources I read said there'd be multiple people buried in each. So it's not a consistent messaging there. But yeah, not all Indians who died got buried in a mound, because there's not that many of them. Yeah, John?
As we drive that stretch several times a week, we can see smaller mounds on either side of the highway.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see where that may have been one person or two persons.
Yeah, and I'll show you a map in just a moment with the interstate, so you get a sense of perspective. Yes?
Yeah, and he also explained to us too, the number of mounds that were destroyed
Mm-hmm.
in the highway in
Mm-hmm.
before they realized what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But yet there was tons of these mounds that were literally destroyed.
Yeah. Ron Yobb did share with us that the construction person for the highway told his workers that if they uncover human remains, don't say anything because they'll make us stop. Yeah. Although not all of them were lost, but some of them were. Yeah. The Justice Committee is working with Ron Yobb to set a date this spring to go back to the mounds. Watch your bulletin. Be glad to have you. It's very much a beautiful space. So the Norton Mounds was the center of this culture from about 400 BC to 400 AD, so about 800 years. The researchers think the mounds were constructed about 2,000 years ago. They're called the Norton Mounds because the captain, A.N. Norton, owned the property. They were first excavated by a Mr. Coffinberry, whose name keeps coming up repeatedly in the literature. He was very much involved in archaeological research. And the Swedenborgen Church, Carolyn. It's interesting, he was a part of that also. And then in 1936, Mrs. Stiles deeded the land to the city, and the area became a city park. It's listed on the Historic Register, declared a National Historic Landmark. It's about 55 acres, and it's closed to the public, but it's accessible through people like Ron Yobb. So during the highway, the Norton Mound Group was slated to be destroyed when the interstate was going to be put through. But a group of people decided they wanted to take action and salvage it. So in 1963, 1964, with grants from the Grand Rapids Foundation and the National Science Foundation, they were able to change the course of the interstate, and I'll show you that in a map. They were able to preserve most, but not all, of the mounds. Mr. Coffinberry, his initial exploration in 1874 found 17 mounds in the group. The three largest ones are near the river, and then there's others that are kind of in a curved line behind them, away from the river. And by 1963, only 11 of the 17 were substantially untouched, so we lost 6 of them. 4 had been completely obliterated. So in those mounds, I found from the Federal Register, there were remains of 48 individuals and over 500 funerary objects. So of the 11 mounds that remain, they range 30 feet in diameter, 1.5 feet in height, to 100 feet in diameter and 15 feet tall. So those are the photographs I showed you a moment ago. And there was a whole process of how they built these. So there was a series of layers of dirt, ash, a mound cap, layer of sod, and then the burial chambers was mostly below grade, but not always. But most of the time they were. And the burial pits, yeah, they're shallow, maybe 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep, and rectangular in shape. Okay, we kind of touched on this already, so I'll just skim over this.
Dave, are you familiar with, I'm sure you must be, Frankfurter, who was the director at the museum, Public Museum for many, many years?
What's the name?
Frankfurter.
Frankfurter, okay. Yeah?
He was director of the museum, and he was friends of my wife Barbara for about 60, 65 years.
Uh-huh.
And he worked during that time to help save the mound.
Yeah.
As a landmark.
Yeah. It only took a few voices to really stand up and speak and say, hey, we've got to do better here. It's not all about progress and the automobile. We need to honor these other peoples. So here's one map. This is from 1940, where's my source? From the Grand Rapids City Engineer's Office. You can see here, let's see. So here's Grand River Boulevard, and this hash mark is a park, and here's the Indian Mounds. So apparently all of this was a park in 1940, essentially from where the railroad Pure Marquette shops are. I biked that last summer. And the waste treatment place is right there. So this is before the interstate went in. This is
bridge that goes over that, is that the old railroad bridge?
yes, this is the railroad bridge, yeah.
Bike path now.
Yeah, this is now a bike path, which gets you up to Millennium Park, which is over here. Yeah. And that bridge is a good marker if you want to find the mounds, yeah. So here's a current map. So I've highlighted in yellow the park and then the mounds. You can see the interstate, and it takes a jog. So I think that there was some rerouting that was done so it didn't run closer up in here, which would have impacted more of the mounds. So they brought it a little further away from the water. So the human remains and the associated funerary objects have all been repatriated. And so in 2010, so 14 years ago, the Public Museum gave these physical remains of 104 people and 796 objects to 11 Indian tribes in bands in Michigan, Indiana, and Oklahoma, because research tells us those people had a connection to the people that were here, although it is not clear that they're the same people. But Oklahoma, Michigan, and Indiana had connections to this land. And so there's a notice of inventory that notes where the finding was and how many remains or objects in each. And what the Public Museum had was from 2 locations in Allegan, 1 in Berrien, 3 in Cass, 1 in Grand Traverse, 1 in Kalamazoo, 6 in Kent County, 3 in Montcalm, 2 in Ottawa, 2 in St. Joseph, and then Wayne County also. So they acquired these between 1869 and 1969, so over a 100-year period. Often what it was is people like Mr. Ensler who are doing a construction and find something, they call up the authorities, they get them in touch with the museum. The museum would then send archaeologists, maybe from a local university, to go and excavate, and then they take the items to the museum for safekeeping. And that's how they acquired them over that 100-year period. So the earlier comment about protections, yeah, under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that's why the museum did what they did. There was a whole process, and there's the link if you wanted to see their report. The museum in Muskegon did the same thing. I mean, pretty much all the museums around the country had to give these items back to peoples that had some connection to the deceased. So the Hopewell, or the Mounds people, were driven out of present-day Michigan by the Prairie Indians, and they were exterminated by the Algonquin Nation. I need to say, Indians are not savages. Usually when this stuff was happening, it was looking for places for food and safe protection from other warring nations. So it was survival of their people, and that's why the Hopewell to the Prairie to the Algonquin. The Algonquin is 3. You've probably heard of the 3 fires. So the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. So what I have here in bold is their spelling of their names. The Ottawa is not the Ottawa, O-T-T-A-W-A. That's how we spell it. They spell it Ottawa. The Potawatomi, or the Potawatomi, okay, and the Ojibwa, or the, help me out here, is this the Chippewa? Yeah, thank you. So the Ojibwa were further north, the Ottawa mid-state, and the Potawatomi further south. So the Grand River Valley, occupied by the Ottawas. They had villages from like the mouth of the Grand River by Grand Haven, Crockery Creek, Grand Rapids, Plainfield, Ada, Lowell, all the way upriver. In the 1600s, the Ottawa established on the river named Washtenaw Sipi, or Grand River, or Faraway River. It's because of the length, 252 miles. And where does the Grand River's headwaters?
Jackson.
Yes, Jackson, Michigan. A little bit of a long piece here, but this is from the people of the 3 fires. So this is written by Indians, and I thought it was worthy to share. The existence of Native American populations in the Americas has always been of interest to European and contemporary scholars. It should be clearly stated, however, that Native peoples do not always subscribe to academic interpretations of their respective histories and beliefs. Yeah, for me to tell you what you believe, yeah. For centuries, scholars have been attempting to theoretically explain the origins of American Indians. In contrast, it should be remembered that the Native peoples have formalized traditions which describe their existence in diverse regions. American Indians explain their life and past as an act of creation rather than a stage in evolutionary theory. All peoples have an undeniable right to spiritual interpretations of life and purpose. These beliefs are the very core of Native American societies and must be considered as viable alternatives excuse me, to continuously changing scientific explanations. Excuse me. I thought I was over my cold. It's now, as I talk, it's getting worse. So in 1804, the first Europeans arrived. They're either affiliated with a mission, a Roman Catholic mission, or a Baptist mission in the Grand Rapids area, or they were fur traders, often the French, who came from the Detroit area. Rix Robinson, yes, and he was settled in, that was in Lowell. I think that's where he had his trading post. In 1821, so about 15 years later, there were 50 or 60 Indian huts on the west side of the Grand River. So the west side of the Grand River was the Indian land. In the east side, where Campaw and Lyon were developing Grand Rapids, was the, oh please, thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Okay. So here's an 1823 Michigan territory map. If you'll notice on the side, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Chippewa. Okay. So this is before Michigan became a state. This is when Michigan was a territory in 1823. And then here's a map showing where the Ottawa had villages. And there's a total of 15 of them. A number of them, I think there's 5 of them by Little Traverse Bay, 1 by the mouth of the White River, 1 by the mouth of the Muskegon River, and with the Grand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So as you go inland. None of them in Kalamazoo or St. Joseph River. That would have been the Potawatomi. So these were where the Ottawas had their villages. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. Come on, computer. So naming terminology. I mean, what do we call these people? Indian, American Indian, Native, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations? I've settled on Indian. And the reason I say that, thanks, Carolyn. Okay. The reason I say that is last summer at Camp Henry, once a week, the Newaygo County Native Circle comes to Camp Henry, has dinner with the campers and the counselors, and then that evening, they do an educational program. They split the kids, the younger campers, the older campers. They do an educational program, then halfway through they switch. The one gentleman that I listened to said, he says, I call myself Indian because in the treaties with the US government, they call me Indian. So that gives me legal standing. And he says, I don't like the word indigenous because that sounds like another word. I'm thinking ignorant or indigent, yeah. So he prefers Indian. I prefer that also. So the treaties between the US government and the Indian nations. There's 2 treaties that really relate to the land that Westminster Presbyterian Church has property. So the 1821 is the Treaty of Chicago, and 1836 is the Treaty of Washington. Here's a map of the state of Michigan, and it shows the 1821 treaty is south of the Grand River, No, it's 117, so it goes across and then down. And then 36 is north of the Grand River, UP. There it goes. Boom. So Grand Rapids is south of the Grand River, so that's this land that we're standing on today. Camp Henry is north of the Grand River in Nuevo County. So those two treaties relate to our current land. There was a book by Jackson, a female author, Indian, and she says, of the 370 U.S. government ratified Indian treaties, so the U.S. Congress ratified them, none were completely fulfilled by the U.S. government. So if you've ever heard the word Indian giver, it's no, turn it around. Yeah. We promised as the white people, and we didn't deliver on any of the 370. Just want to move on this quickly in the interest of time. So the values and beliefs of the Indians, the Ottawa centered around the natural world. Ottawa beliefs define the acceptable ways to interact with the elements of the world, and worship was not separated from daily life. Sounds kind of Reformed theology. Everywhere the Ottawa went, and each task they performed required an understanding of the realm beyond their physical surroundings. So it's not what you see. There's another energy. Every element in the Ottawa world, from rocks and trees to animals, human beings, was made up of two basic parts, the body and the Manitou, the body and the spirit. Communal living. The Ottawa lived in tandem with nature, but also with each other. Their society was first and last communal. Land was held by the village. It was not held by individuals. The harvest aimed at supplying enough food until the next season. Sharing and reciprocity were the deepest values. Balance and proportion, their reigning ideals. This is from the book by James Bratt, historian at Calvin University, Gathered at the River. It's a very well-written piece. Oh, okay, sorry. How are we doing on time, Karen?
It's about 1:45.
Okay. So Ottawa religion and beliefs. In the Ottawa system, religion was nothing and everything. On the one hand, they had no equivalent for our Western concept of faith. They recognized no natural, supernatural dichotomy, no impersonal forces, fixed separations between the living and the dead, the visible and the invisible. On the other hand, religion was enmeshed as the tone and texture and the framework of their whole round of life. In the Ottawa universe, every being and object had or could have a spirit, or a Manitou, as well as a body. Manitous were powerful and could readily change form or embodiment, and could be used for good or evil, and had to be treated with care and respect. So think about a couple years ago, the whole water protectors, okay, with the Indian communities out west, the water protectors, you know. It makes total sense when I read this piece. Okay, we'll skip over this. On the missions, we'll talk a little bit about the missions. So there were two competing missions on the west bank of the Grand River. The Baptist mission just south of Bridge Street, and the Roman Catholic mission just south of Fulton. Come on. So here's a map that Kevin Finney did in 2007. He's Indian, and this is his recollection. So here's the Grand River, here's the rapids. Rapids over a mile long, fall about 18 feet over the limestone ledges. Here's the Thomas mission. It's the Baptist mission. Here's the Roman Catholic mission. Okay. Here's a clearing where the Indians would grow crops. Had a row of trees, oak woods, up on the bluff. On the other side, another bluff. Okay, this is Prospect Hill, which was excavated to fill in around the islands. The Amway Grand Plaza is like right there. So they filled the eastern edge between these islands and the shore with Prospect Hill. And then there was some kind of a fight between the Baptists and the Catholics over what would happen to the land after the Indians left their village. Because there had been an Indian presence there for many years. There were even Indian mounds, of course. Those were the Converse mounds, which were eradicated. Here's another map showing the terrain. So you got the rapids, the vegetation, the Indian trails. And I want to jump ahead in the interest of time and talk about Indian trails. Ottawa means to trade. Fur prices, if you're curious. I want to go back to this one. So there was very sharp competition in the fur trade, such that the fur traders would send their representatives into the forest to bring the pelts back, and they'd extend credit. And then late in the fall, the Indians would separate, and each family would go to camp and then settle at the rapids. But the note I found was interesting. The Indians liked that the French would give credit for goods until the fall when they would bring the furs. When the British fought the French, the Indians supported the French as the British would not extend Indians credit. Follow the dollar. Grand River had a number of islands, either 4 or 5, depending on how you count. And island number 1 or 2 was where the first county jail was. Our own Alcatraz of sorts. I think it was this one, the furthest away from the land. Yeah. Although we didn't have any sharks, like they do in California.
That's another story.
Yeah. Okay, come on. The rapids, we spoke a bit about that. Some of the early streets, you can see again the islands that were since filled in, so now it's land pretty much all through here. This has all been filled in. If you look at some of the old Westminster documents, like Carolyn knows, we were on Island Street. It used to be called Island. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Some Grand Rapids history, Prospect Hill. So I mentioned about this, how they leveled it to fill in the channel. And there's some maps to show where Prospect Hill was and the channel that was filled in. The Grand River Canal. This is kind of interesting. Okay, so Fulton Street Cemetery down Fulton, about 1.5 miles, is the oldest remaining cemetery in the city. Its first burial was from 1838. A 25-year-old man named Andrew Haldane. John Ball is buried there. His wife Mary is buried there, and others of note. But the burying ground, this is just up the street. This is at Madison and Cherry. And this was known as the burying ground when Grand Rapids was a village, before it was a city. And this is where they would inter people. I believe they've moved them because there's now houses there. But, you know, that's just up the street from Westminster.
There is a house here in Heritage Hill that the original owners of it, had Indian work for them, and they loved her so much they buried her in the yard, and she's still buried.
Oh, okay. Okay. Nice. Veterans Park. So often the Indian payments, when there would be a treaty, they would say, you give us this land and we'll give you so much money every year for 20 years or even in perpetuity. And then once a year, the Indians would come to Grand Rapids, come down by canoe to the river to come up, and sometimes they would even go to what is now Veterans Park, which is where the city hall was, and that's where the federal government would make payments. And this is a piece by John Ball who talks about that process, and his final statement is, "So our merchants provided themselves with such goods as they purchased, and soon the Indians' money changed hands, and I fear sometime wrongfully." So, interesting, the adults, the man, woman, and child each received the same payment amount. It wasn't based on if you're a minor or if you're an adult. There was a Potawatomi Club here in Grand Rapids in 1886. I'll skip over this part about Westminster. Yeah. Well, okay, we'll look at a few photographs. So the Swedenborgen Church is right here. So this is Division, and I think this is Lion. And then Westminster rented from them for a couple of years, and then we bought the property across the street. But then the federal government, through eminent domain, took the property because they wanted to build a post office. And so we moved to this location where we've been for 106. I've got it.
1875 is when we moved here, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
85 we built the house, but we lived here for 10 years before we could afford to build a sanctuary. We had a little chapel on it.
Over on the side, yeah. Mm-hmm.
We saved our money for 10 years.
Oh, okay. So here's a photo of Westminster, figures between 1887 and 1888. Some of the streetscapes, you see the trees, the mature trees, see the trolley lines. Mm-hmm. This is State Street right over here by the museum school. Talk about that in just a moment. Some more old photos. Oh, back to Camp Henry. So Camp Henry's in Newaygo County. I really want to find out if Kimball Lake had an Indian name. And I have still not got an answer to that question, although a year ago I found from an ex-colleague who is Indian, this U.S. Geological Survey site. And I think I'm going to research there to see if they know of any Indian name for Lake Kimball. So many streets radiate out from downtown Grand Rapids, and they were old Indian trails. So examples are Plainfield Avenue going north and east, Walker Avenue going north and west, Monroe Center, State Street, Kalamazoo Avenue, Lake Drive, Robinson Road, and Butterworth. So I always wondered, and I was talking to Jim about this at the luncheon, State Street is only 2 blocks long. It runs on a diagonal. All the streets around it are on north, south, east, west grid. Why? It's only 2 blocks long. So Monroe Avenue formerly ran diagonally across Sheldon, LaGrave, and Jefferson, connected with State Street, which was the western portion of Kalamazoo Avenue. So then State Street continued on across Morris, Paris, Charles, to connect it to Kalamazoo Avenue. So here's a map. So here is State Street. This is where Westminster is. This is Monroe. This was owned by Louis Campbell. Campbell was French. The French always platted their roads to follow natural terrain. They followed a bluff, they followed a river, they followed water, they followed an Indian trail. He followed the Indian trail. That's why State Street is on a diagonal and everything else is on a grid. And there's a golf range, Kalamazoo and 28th Street. What's it called? Okay, so now is it making sense? Why it's called Indian Trails? Okay. And interesting, in my genealogy research, Indian Trails is adjacent to a cemetery. And the idea was, if they ever needed to expand the cemetery, they've got the Indian Trails, which is not developed land, that they could expand the cemetery to the south. But until then, they're going to be playing golf. Come on. Okay. Street name changes. In 1912, a lot of changes happened. A thing to keep in mind, as a distant cyclist, I remember that 800 equals a mile. So if I'm biking anywhere in Kent, Ottawa, Newaygo County, 800 is a mile. So if you're wondering how far is it from 28th Street to 36th Street, that's 800, that's a mile, okay? East-west, same thing. So in Kent County, it's 800 is a mile. In 1920, a lot of street names were changed. So the second one there says Island Street is now Weston, and that change happened in 1920. Fifth Street has had a few changes. Fifth to Franklin to Dr. Martin Luther King. Cherry Street used to be called Ellsworth. It's always fascinating to see them.
That cherry was called Rose.
Rose?
Yeah, Morris Mansion, the owner of that, he owned the cherry trees
Yeah.
all around here.
Okay.
And he built that house and named the street after his wife.
Ah, yeah.
They changed it.
So it went from Ellsworth to Rose to Cherry. Got it. Good. Good to know. Other street naming, LaGrave, I always thought, well, that means French for like the dead, the serious. Well, Mr. Daniels laid out that addition to the city, and he named the street after his father-in-law, William E. LaGrave. Lewis Street, named after Louis Campaw. Anthony Street, named after Anthony Campaw. Lyon, after Lucius Lyon. And Wealthy Street, always wondered how that got its name. I thought, oh, it's because it goes to East Grand Rapids. No. It was given by Judge Morrison as a compliment to his wife. So. Maybe the judge married into money. I don't know. Okay. 2 minutes, okay. Got some census information. This is helpful to know. So in 2020, the Michigan had 10 million and change of people. The census breaks down ethnicity, if you will, by American Indian and Alaska Native. So statewide, 0.6%. Kent County, we had 0.7%. Newaygo, 1%. Ottawa, 0.5%, and Muskegon County, 0.9. So that's a sizable citizenry. And then there's my bibliography. Since we got a minute left, is there anything else to touch on? Oh, all over. No, not that I've noticed. Mainly on the near northwest side, but not exclusively. They're pretty much salt and peppered in with everybody else, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Cut me some slack because my age, you may have said this very clearly. Why mound for burial?
Why the mound? Why that shape?
Yeah, well, nobody knows.
I mean, drainage, protection, durability, pyramids. I mean, I'm just thinking of other structures.
See, but for one person, this is sizable.
Yeah. Because it would take a whole community to build them.
There's a huge one in Xenia, Ohio.
Okay.
A huge one that would fill this sanctuary.
Wow.
Much easier to do a hole in the ground, right?
Well, and the other thing is, the people that are buried in a mound, are they people of note? I mean, do they have status?
Dan,
See
is
if I
there
can-
any evidence of cremation? Of way of disposing of the dead?
Oh, by the Indians?
Yeah, did they cremate their funeral pyres, you know?
I haven't read of that.
I don't know if there's any evidence of it.
Has anybody?
It's more the Western Indians did that.
Yeah, I worked for the Kumeyaay Indians up in San Diego. They were forced up into the mountains, and they still to this day do the burial with all the belongings out the fire cremation.
Okay.
All the belongings. The tribe still practices that out there. They were moved up there from San Diego. The first year, they lost 3/4 of their tribe because they get snow up there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very sad story.
Well, I know I see other questions. What I'd like to
Yep.
do is dismiss us with a blessing, and then if you have questions, Daniel has agreed to stay as long as your passion and his passion maintain, interest. And also, he's right, there's another box of the book, so please come up
Yeah.
and remember to grab a book if you want one, and in turning your name tag to me. So before we go into that question period, I'd like to dismiss those that need to leave at 2 o'clock with an Apache blessing. May the sun bring you new energy by day. May the moon softly restore you by night. May the rain wash away your worries. May the breeze blow new strength into your being. May you walk gently through the world and know its beauty all the days of your life. Go in peace. And now I will, again, if you want to come up or ask questions of Daniel, but if you need to go.
Okay.
So now Jean had a question.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't heard of that, but I know that at Westminster we're trying to set up a relationship with Ron Yob, with the Grand River Bands of the Ottawa Indians, to develop a relationship between our faith community and his community, to have a deeper understanding of each other. So watch with the Justice Committee for that development, if you will. But as far as land and reparations of land, I haven't heard of that. Yeah.
If you did not get a book and want one, just give me your name and I will. So Robin needs one? Okay, thank you.
Did I understand you correctly? The Hopewell Indians, the name Hopewell,
Yeah.
was that derived from the